Howdy, y'all, and welcome to the EEARSS Podcast, produced by Terrier TV. I am Frank, that is Bill, and that is Cindy, and we are the EEARSS Podcast. That was a little bit different. I tried to mix it up for a second.
That was
Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
Very good.
How's it going, guys?
Go ahead, you get to go first.
How goes it?
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
There we
Wonderful's
go.
fair. Yeah.
She said wonderful.
Yep.
It's okay. It's getting along.
She always tells me not to ask her that, but somehow I mistakenly
But you
do it
do.
every single
You do
time.
it every
I don't
time.
mean to. It just comes across that way, and I apologize. So I'll digress early on.
There we go.
Does that
Indeed.
seem fair?
Yeah, it
Seems
does.
fair. Man, so we've been talking about today's guest for a while. I am
Yes.
super excited about this. As
Mhm.
soon as him and I touched base a few months ago now, we've been chatting about this and going back and forth. I don't know about you guys, but I've been doing tons of reading and digging into this because, as a kid and even as a young adult, I knew a little bit about the subject, but I didn't know anything compared to what's out there.
Whatever the Leonard Nimoy show, you know that one?
Oh,
In Search of.
In Search
In
of.
Search
Yeah.
of. That's like my whole knowledge
Is
of,
it?
of the
Okay.
subject matter.
Yeah. Well, it's just funny, because we had Adrian Shine on a couple weeks
Right.
ago,
Yep.
who has spent his entire career studying Loch Ness,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's part of science. It's
Oh, yeah.
it's part of science.
absolutely.
There's science to it, and it's neat to have two men on back to back who are true scientists.
Right.
So
Who are looking at it scientifically.
yeah, it's
Yep.
pretty special stuff. So you guys ready to jump into this?
Absolutely.
Give him a chance to talk instead of talking about him.
Let's do it.
All right. So today on the podcast, we are joined by Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Sir, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. So, we were talking about this a little bit. I know you've been through some things here recently that, first off, we're very glad you're here and able to join us and back to being healthy. That was some scary stuff you just went through here recently.
It was, yeah. No, I nearly punched my ticket. I've dodged several bullets in the recent past, and this was a rather exciting one, but quite the adventure. But yeah, glad to be here on the mend, still working at it. I'm slated to go in for an ultrasound to check up and make sure everything is still tight and plugged up and not leaking, and I don't want to lose any more blood.
No, you don't want to play that game. We'll for sure keep you in thought and prayer on that one too. That's a lot to have on your mind, buddy.
Yeah, but it's all good. We're in a very good place and on a good trajectory, and it's just going up from here. So I'm very, very pleased. It's such a contrast to those first several months right afterward. But I'm thankful and hopeful that things will continue to improve as they have been, and it certainly has limited some of my ambitions. I'm rethinking some of my retirement bucket list a little bit, but nevertheless, I'm glad to be here to even have this conversation. So,
yes, sir. Yeah, we've all had our journeys, our medical journeys. I know for me, next week is 3 years for me post open heart surgery. So, if anybody gets it, I get it. We've all had those things without a doubt. So
that's right. Yep.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what you do for a living. I know you're a professor. Tell us a little bit about what you do for a living and how you got to the point where you're at and studying what you study.
Right. Well, I was one of, to take it back just a couple of steps, I was one of some of the first students to sort of go through the gauntlet of a new program, a new approach to the study of physical anthropology, or what now is more popularly called biological anthropology. There was a shortage of anatomists. Most traditional anatomy departments in colleges and universities, medical schools across the country were becoming more and more cellular and subcellular in their emphasis. And so no one in the department to teach gross anatomy of the gross level of organization and function and so forth of the body. So they cast about and they discovered that there were people who had those skills in anthropology departments, who had training in comparative anatomy and paleontology, and so forth in the subdiscipline of physical anthropology that was preoccupied with the physical aspects of the study of humanity. And so there began to be these hybrid departments with novel programs where the students were rubbing shoulders with medical students in the first couple of years of their coursework training, but then pursued their interests in physical anthropology. And I was in one of those early classes. So my degree is in anatomical sciences. It was awarded from a Department of Anatomy at SUNY Stony Brook, but with an emphasis, kind of in parentheses, an emphasis in physical anthropology. So I teach human gross anatomy. In this case, I'm at Idaho State University, where we don't have a medical school. The state does now have an osteopathic school, but it's over in Treasure Valley on the opposite side of the state, outside of Meridian, near Boise. But Idaho State University is the designated health professions institution otherwise in the state, and so we have a whole litany of programs like occupational and physical therapy, physician's assistants, graduate nursing, a feeder dental program, quite a number of different health professions made available to students. And so I teach human gross anatomy at the graduate level in the occupational physical therapy program. So it's a full-body dissection, a lab lecture course. And then, as well as, I teach other things. I teach sectional anatomy and radiographic sciences. I used to teach survey of living primates and the primate fossil record, human evolution in the anthropology department. Been supplanted by some younger upstarts who got their PhDs and now are teaching some of those courses. But then, when I do research, it is focused on within my emphasis in physical anthropology, and particularly, I'm interested in the evolution of human bipedalism, how it is that we came to be adapted to walk on two legs, and so I do research that involves studies on living subjects, both human and non-human primate. I'm interested in the footprint, the fossil footprint record as trace evidence for adaptations to walking on two legs in our early hominin ancestors. I do work on paleontological specimens, so the fossilized bones, especially those of the lower extremity and particularly the foot, as it relates to those adaptations, and so on. Have had the good fortune of being able to dabble in a lot of other things along the way because of my broad interests in functional morphology generally. So I've discovered new species of extinct primate in South America. I've done DNA studies looking at the evolutionary history of South American primates, and I've had the opportunity to go to other countries to look at museum collections of fossils of our human ancestors, especially those relating to locomotion, how we move about, and so on. And that keeps me, well, then obviously the emphasis, the study of footprints set me in a very opportune position to evaluate very objectively and from a very informed position the footprint evidence attributed to Sasquatch. And so after having the opportunity to examine a long line of tracks, very fresh tracks in the mud outside of Walla Walla, Washington back in 1996, the hook was kind of set, and I got pulled into this. So that has, taken my career in a very different direction. It's a very complementary direction, I should say, and that's how I spend my time. Yeah.
Do you remember, like, if you're looking back in history, when you were first drawn to an interest in this topic?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, it goes clear back to when I was about 10 or 11 years old in 5th grade, living in Spokane, Washington. It just so happened that Roger Patterson, who had, along with Bob Gimlin, had captured that notorious 60 seconds of film that seemed to, that purported to portray a Bigfoot in Northern California, in the Bluff Creek area, walking across the sandbar in front of the camera. It was one of the first public showings of the film in Spokane that year. And so I had never heard of Bigfoot prior to that, although I was fascinated with primates. And, some of the stories of the Yeti were just gaining some public notoriety at that time. That was the season of all the mountaineering sieges to conquer Everest, and so that was in the background as well. I was convinced my dad we had to go see this at the Spokane Coliseum, and so my younger brother and I, and my dad went, and we were on the third row seat, in third row seats there, right in the center, as Roger came walking out on the stage to introduce this documentary that he had produced showcasing the footage. And it was just, I mean, talk about an impression to see that portrayed, or projected larger than life, walking across the screen. And, I was very into natural history. From the time I could walk, I was bringing bugs and snakes and things, toads, into the house. And, my mom would have to, I can still remember this one time when she caught me at the garage door, trying to come in through the kitchen to go to my room, and with a paper grocery bag in my hand. She said, "What do you have in there?" So I opened it up, and this grocery bag was half full of garter snakes.
Oh, no.
Just writhing. There must have been 2 or 3 dozen. And she, out. She once let me bring a little baby garter snake into the house to play with it in the front room, and she had some lady friends over visiting, and I got distracted because the conversation was kind of interesting, and I looked back down at my knees there where I was kneeling, and the snake was gone.
Oh, no.
So it was an exciting 15 minutes as she and these 2 lady guests were searching under the cushions and under the couch and behind the drapes, for this missing garter snake, and we finally found it. It was, but anyway, so I was. So when I saw, the point being is, when I saw this thing going across the screen, I mean, it wasn't like I was a total novice, and I was struck by just how natural, how in context it appeared to be. It just was part of the landscape, and it just seemed extremely natural. It was where it belonged to be, where it was supposed to be, where it belonged, and so it made a huge impression. And then subsequently, and I've told this story many times, but maybe some of your listeners haven't. But in the next year, my 6th grade year, we actually did a unit on primates, a large unit, and multifaceted. But I remember we, since the previous exposure, I had become a member of the Northwest Research Association that Roger had created in order to generate subscription revenue flow, and I had purchased his book. I had even purchased a resin replica of his cast, taken one of the 2 casts he took at the Patterson-Gimlin film site. And besides looking for books in the library and the occasional magazine or newspaper article, there wasn't a whole lot of information, it seemed. In any case, as part of the introduction to this topic, this unit of study, we were talking about and defining primates, the concept of the order primates, and we were listing on the board as students would volunteer or try to infer what were some of the distinguishing characteristics of primates. And then, secondarily, we listed the names, the common names of various primates, representative primates that we might know. And someone, and I'm sure just attempting to be cute, raised their hand and said, well, Bigfoot. Well, to her credit, I still remember it was Mrs. Davis, to her credit, rather than blowing it off and just dismissing it as silliness, she said, well, let's think about this. How do eyewitnesses who claim to have seen a Bigfoot describe it? And we ticked off, some of the characteristics that define primates. And she said, so should we include it on our list? Everyone, of course, said yes. And then the next step was to volunteer to do a report, an extensive report and class presentation on one of these representative primates. And my hand shot up faster than anyone in class, so that I got to choose, and actually we did it in pairs. So I had a partner, another young fellow who was also really interested. And here's the funny twist, and not many, I have told this story, but not many people may know this, but I suddenly, as I pointed out, there wasn't a whole lot of information. And I was a little concerned, how are we going to have, glean enough content to make a presentation to the class and do this report, this major report. And she said, well, go talk to your librarian. This was in the age before internet.
Yes.
The
so
we went down
catalog.
Yeah, exactly. Went down the hallway and described our dilemma to the librarian, and she smiled and turned around, and in the filing cabinet behind her desk, she pulls open a drawer. She had a clippings collection of all kinds of topics, a topical clipping collection, which was common in those days. And out comes a manila folder, just not bulging, but it was plump with magazine articles and newspaper clippings and so forth relating to Bigfoot, Sasquatch. And she had a brand spanking new copy of John Green's On the Track of the Sasquatch, which is a classic treatment. John Green was a journalist living up in Harrison Hot Springs in British Columbia, and had done a story covering an encounter by a family up on the Fraser River. And he was so impressed by the credibility of these witnesses and their vivid description of this creature that came walking out of the tree line down across their pasture and pilfered some of the potatoes and salted salmon from their shed, that he started digging into this topic and learning about the traditions of surrounding Sasquatch in British Columbia. Anyway, so we were the first to check out. I was the first to check out the book. I was kind of taking the lead on this, and anyway, many years later, the first public presentation I gave was in Harrison Hot Springs. I was invited up to the the annual event that Stephen Harvey, I think was his name, the organizer. Anyway, I get to the hotel, the lodge, and there was apparently some confusion along the way, and there was no room for me, no reservation, and they were booked solid. And I, so jokingly, I said, well, can I sleep out on the beach, alongside the lake? And I hear this voice from behind and above me, because he's quite tall, saying, don't be ridiculous, you're coming home with me. And I turned around, and it was none other than John Green. And so I got to spend the weekend in the home of John Green, and it turned out that his other house guest was none other than John Bindernagel. So that was my first introduction to John Bindernagel, and the beginning of a long collaboration. And we're still all sorry to see that he left us sooner than we hoped. But here's where it was really funny. As we're sitting here the first evening there, just comparing notes and getting acquainted, and I'm this new guy on the block, but John was quite impressed with my understanding of the history and the mastery of many of the details. And he said, "Where did you go to school?" Excuse me, sorry about that. I'm going to have to grab a bottle of water here.
Oh, no worries, sir.
I said Indian Trail Elementary in Spokane. And he goes, "And who was your librarian?" And I'm going, "Well, I don't really remember the librarian." He said, "It didn't happen to be Mary Bessaker did it." And it was just the penny dropped and that cling of recognition. I said, "I think it was. I did. That sounds like the right name." And he immediately reaches across and picks up the phone receiver and dials and said, "Mary." And it turns out Mary was his niece.
What?
He said, "Mary." Yeah. He goes, "Mary, you'll never believe who's sitting across the table from me." And she, of course, remembered because I was the first. She had just received this brand spanking new, hot off the press copy of her uncle's book. I was the first student to have the privilege of checking it out. And so it was really, talk about a small world.
Talk about absolute confirmation that you are exactly where the universe wanted you to be.
That's right. I know. There have been so many of those kind of experiences. It's really weird. I'm not one to believe in fate, but I'm telling you, and I guess, in hindsight, well, it's not always that way, but in hindsight, things line up, I guess, when you look back. But there were so many quirky twists of coincidence along the route from there to here that you have to sometimes stop and wonder if you really are on the right course, or at least you're doing things that dovetail with some plan.
Yeah, I'd say that's the exact confirmation that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. That's really, really neat. That's really, really neat. Okay, so I got a couple questions for you. Studying this topic, which, the more I dug into it over these past, couple of months since originally talking to you, you realize there's so many different people that perceive different things on it. I mean, there's everything from people saying this is the craziest idea they've ever heard of, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Yeti, all the things. And there's people that are so hard to their direction where they almost get upset about it when people want to ask them questions, because it's a concrete thing. How dare you even question it? Which there's so many things in life that are that way. I mean, people could say faith is that way too, but there's a lot of it's whenever do you get tired of having to answer these questions when people ask them, like, so why in the world do you believe what you believe? Do you get tired of hearing that question?
Oh, no, I don't. When it's a sincere question and not simply a challenge.
Right.
I mean, there are some people who are just badgering, and no matter what your answer is, it will have zero impact on them because their mind is made up. And don't clutter the conversation with facts. I mean, I'm sticking to my opinion, my emotion, my conclusion. So in those situations, then I've learned it doesn't pay to do that. Now, unless there are impressionable people looking on for whom this will be an enlightening lesson, then I'm perfectly willing to joust and spar with a skeptic or critic.
Yeah,
but
I have to say, 3 months ago when Frank first started saying, "Hey, here's who we're gonna interview," I didn't know most of the research that was out there. I knew, the sci-fi version of Bigfoot, and I went down the rabbit hole of reading research papers that you've written, that your colleagues have written. I have learned more about this topic than I ever thought I could have, and there is an overwhelming amount of actual real science that can't not all of these sightings can just be explained away. And I 3 months ago was somebody that thought Bigfoot was just a myth, and now wow.
Yeah, well, and there's a lot can be lost in words too. People frequently ask me, do I believe in Bigfoot? Well, I say no. And sometimes I'll let a pregnant pause hang in the air as that sort of settles in, and they're surprised. This is very effective when a journalist asks me this. And I say, I step up onto my little soapbox and deliver my sermonette. But belief, as it's used and as it's probably intended by the questioner, connotes a position of faith or an acceptance, typically an acceptance of things in the absence of evidence. Now, you can argue, we can split hairs about the definition of faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I'm a very objective person, even when it comes to spiritual or religious concerns. And so, but most people, when you say you believe in something, you've adopted a conviction just based on your emotional response to it, largely. But I am convinced by the data, not believing in the absence of data. And so someone once gave me a T-shirt that they had designed, and it had kind of a silhouette, a highlighted silhouette of Patty from the Patterson-Gimlin film walking across, and then across the bottom it said, "Believing since 1967." And I said, can I edit this? And they go, well, sure. So I took a big silver Sharpie and I drew a line through believing, and I wrote convinced since 1967. And they go, oh, I like that. Can I incorporate that into the next edition of the T-shirt? I mean, it's a very different posture. It's like you said, I'm to the point where how could I walk away from this? How could I just say, all these sightings, all these footprints, all these experiences, they're just misidentifications, misapprehensions. They're just impressionable, imaginative people making things, or less less worthy, people intentionally just making up stories for clicks on the internet or whatever. There is so much substance. People. One time, years ago, I was chided by this one member of the anthropology department, and I was, teaching courses for the anthro department, and I was including a lecture in the curriculum for a couple of my classes that touched on the notion of relic hominoids, of the existence of remnant populations like Sasquatch or like the Yeti, where it was appropriate in the curriculum. A survey of living primates. Well, could there be other unrecognized living primates? Or when we look at the fossil record and we talk about the adaptive radiation of apes and early hominins, could there be any relict species, lineages that persisted through time? Anyway, so he had made a big enough stink that this was on par with me teaching, or with him in an archaeology course discussing chariots of the gods and von Däniken's theories as if they had scientific merit. And I said, well, there's no comparison whatsoever. So the chairman invited me to attend the faculty meeting and just kind of present my case and defend my position. And so I did. And one of the quips I made was, I'm sure that there are some of you who think that I'm sitting up there in my lab collecting footprint casts like some stamp collector. I said, but it's not that. And I went through and described the research that we're doing. And I described all the collaborations that I was currently involved with, whether it was with professional trackers, whether it was with latent fingerprint examiners, whether it was with genetics labs looking at DNA, or the Cornell Bioacoustics Lab, looking at ways to try to record these vocalizations in the field. And afterward, the chairman comes up to me, he goes, well, even before, it wasn't even afterwards, before we had closed, he just sat there and he shook his head and he said, I had no idea of the range of projects that you were involved with and what you were doing. This would make a fantastic senior seminar in our anthropology curriculum.
Wow.
And the poor guy who had dragged me in there, he just rolls his eyes and he literally got up and walked out at that point.
Can you tell us about some of that data and the research? What has been the most, convincing or compelling for you over the years?
Well, of all the things, the footprints still remain the most compelling because of my expertise. I can perhaps appreciate the impact and significance of what the footprint record conveys. And I find that reiterated or reinforced by my interactions with other experts. Now, there aren't many anthropologists who are willing to publicly state that there's merit to what I've pointed out. I mean, it's interesting. Some of the insights I've gained through the study of the footprints attributed to Sasquatch and the unique, well, or not unique, but the distinctive characteristics that define the Sasquatch foot adaptation, namely flat, flexible feet with a non-divergent big toe, have now been recognized as the primary adaptation that characterizes early bipedal hominins in our ancestral tree as it diverged from a common ancestor with the great apes, particularly the chimps. I was pounding that drum for years before it finally was getting acknowledgement and reiteration by other researchers looking at some of the same stuff I was looking at, but also as more and more fossil material was revealed, was discovered, which further reinforced that these little bipedal hominins were walking on flat, flexible feet, just like Sasquatch was. That this quirky adaptation that I was describing, this unprecedented model of the combination of footprints. It was actually one of my colleagues, a good friend. And he's very sympathetic, but he doesn't put any stock or credibility in my conclusions. But he was interviewed on a documentary that I also appeared in, and he pointed out this what he deemed a very unlikely combination of traits, namely the loss of the divergence of the big toe, so that it's now aligned with the other digits. But he points out that the only reason for losing that divergence was in order to incorporate the big toe into the longitudinal arch of the foot. Well, I had argued long and loud that the longitudinal arch was a very recent innovation and only appeared in the hominin fossil record, a few 100,000, 500,000 years ago. And that all these early hominins were walking on flat, flexible feet. Well, that didn't make any sense. Well, now, those that have finally now acknowledged my interpretation of the Laetoli hominin trackway, for example, these Australopithecus afarensis, and I'm sure these names are probably bouncing off the walls and aren't meaning anything to a lot of your listeners, but the earliest species, they may have heard the common name, the colloquial name of Lucy, that's applied to one of the very extensive specimens that was discovered in East Africa by Don Johansson and his team. These critters walked on flat, flexible feet. They had a very mobile instep, which is a carryover from a time when the big toe was divergent, and these creatures climbed in trees up vertical supports, like a lineman going up a telephone pole, only they didn't have spikes, they didn't have a belt, they just were able to grab onto that trunk with that powerful divergent thumb-like big toe. And in order to maintain that grip while the foot still fulfilled its function of leverage to move the body mass up, you had some mobility between the forefoot, which was gripping, prehensile, and the hindfoot, which was propulsive. And that mobility was preserved in these early hominins, even when that great toe no longer was divergent, because they weren't spending much time in the trees. Instead, they were walking on the ground, but on flat, flexible feet. So anyway, this is one aspect of this whole endeavor that I find so amazing, is now that I have lots of gray hair, I can look back and see over the march of time how some of the evidences that I've drawn attention to were present in the record, whether it was a hominin record or whether it was the footprint record of Sasquatch or the Patterson-Gimlin film, actually anticipating subsequent discoveries that reinforced those early interpretations, or subsequent recognition of unusual characteristics or combinations, which are sometimes even more interesting, combinations of multiple interrelated characteristics, which at the time, like take the Patterson-Gimlin film, at the time that it was presented, laid on the altar of science, that there were things there that were absolutely contradictory to conventional wisdom of the time in anthropology. For example, this is my favorite to illustrate this, and I'll try to keep it short. But one of the principal scientists prior to my generation was Dr. John Napier, who was an important figure in the field of primatology and especially primate locomotion. He was also a physician, had been a physician in England and was a specialist in the hands and feet. So he was particularly also well suited to evaluate and assess the merits of the footprint evidence and otherwise the film from a perspective of a comparative primate anatomist, and one particularly familiar with adaptations for locomotion, for moving about. He looked at the film, and in his book, which he wrote, he was actually one of the scientists on the panel at the Smithsonian that viewed the Patterson-Gimlin film. Unfortunately, there was a unanimous negative verdict, sort of, as to its credibility, the likelihood of its credibility or authenticity. And I think he was impressed enough by the subject and the possibility overall that he pursued it and eventually came out in 1972, so 5-ish years later, 4 or 5 years later, came out with the first book written by a scholar, an academic of his standing and credentials, on the subject matter relating to Sasquatch, and he also tackled the Yeti briefly. But when it came to the Patterson-Gimlin film, his treatment in the subject, he pretty much reiterated his previous, pronouncement that it was probably fake. He said, but I'm having trouble really justifying that impression, that opinion. He said, except for the fact that when I look at that figure on the screen, from the waist up, it looks essentially like an ape. But from the waist down, it looks like a human in limb proportions, generally. He said, it is virtually inconceivable that such a hybrid of structure would exist in nature. And so therefore, one half or the other must be contrived, ergo it's a fake. And so now with that in mind, if you look at the unfolding of subsequent discoveries in anthropology, just a few years later was the announcement of the discovery of Lucy, as we talked about earlier, by Don Johansson and his team in Ethiopia. And for the first time, they had much more complete skeletal remains. They had hip bones, pelvis, they had knees, they had ankles, which confirmed without a doubt that these creatures walked upright in a manner fairly similar to ourselves. And how did they describe this to the public, to the lay public, through the popular press? Well, from the waist up, it looks essentially like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, it looks like a human. Well, wait a minute. That was the linchpin of the argument that Napier set forth, his rationale for rejecting the Patterson-Gimlin film. I wonder what would have... He died shortly after the publication of the book, as I recall. But what if he had waited 5 or 10 years before he wrote that book? And Lucy had been discovered, and this whole notion of these little bipeds, little bipedal hominins walking around with this unexpected combination of traits. And we can go down a list of a half dozen or more characteristics, dealing with the craniofacial morphology, with the dental morphology, or the presumed dental morphology, and in inferences based on eyewitness descriptions of the lack of projecting canines, for example. And this combination we talked about earlier with the flat, flexible foot, but with a non-divergent big toe. Things like all these things, which in 1967 cut across the grain of conventional wisdom, and yet subsequently have been confirmed through the discovery of more fossils and a better understanding of the adaptive traits that define, this hominin radiation. I mean, it just blows you away when you think, give Roger the possibility of stumbling, or someone who's coaching him. See, 'cause that's the thing. Where would he have gotten his information if he was trying to come up with something to fool the anthropological community? From an anthropologist, right? But what anthropologist worth his salt, trying to convince his peers, for whatever motivation, would lead him down the Mary Lane with all of these inconceivable combinations of traits? He'd be sabotaging his effort from the get-go. But instead, he got it right, not just once, not just twice, but half a dozen or more times at least, however you want to slice the pie. But that to me is amazing. It's really amazing. And the same thing goes with the footprint evidence. This notion, this interpretation of the flat, flexible foot and the distinctive signature in the footprint that is often associated with these tracks, which is a mid-tarsal pressure ridge that's basically just a displacement of the substrate as the weight is transferred from the entire foot to the forefoot as the heel is elevated, as the step proceeds, and that concentration and the forward impulse of the step may cause the substrate to yield or buckle and throw up either a hump, looks like a speed bump in the middle of the footprint, or sometimes it pushes a disc. A whole chunk of the substrate slides back into the heel as a pressured disc. But the point is, they're present in tracks from as early as 1958. The Jerry Crew track, the famous one where you see with the fellow with the crew cut and the spectacles holding the cast, that was Jerry Crew, who was a cat skinner, caterpillar driver on the road crew working at Bluff Creek when these footprints, these giant 16, 17-inch footprints showed up. And he made the first plaster cast in the United States, anyway, of this track, and it was emblazoned on the headlines of the newspapers, and the term Bigfoot, as it relates to this subject, was born. Well, what's interesting is you look at that image. It was shot with a reporter's camera in those days with the blue flash bulbs that would, and then you'd have to replace it with another. But a real strong, brilliant flash, and you can tell by the heavy shadows behind this guy, it makes everything look flat. He looks like one of those cardboard cutouts you stand next to have a selfie, And the footprint, likewise, is so illuminated that it looks remarkably flat. Well, I had the opportunity to go and visit one of his sons, who became the custodian of that artifact, and he was kind enough to let me get it out of its shadow box and lay it there on the table. And guess what? It has a pressure ridge, just like the tracks from the Patterson-Gimlin film site, and many other examples that I've accumulated from all over the place and through decades of time. Who's explaining to people faking these things, if they were all hoaxes, how to do it in such a remarkably consistent and anatomically reasonable fashion so that Dr. Meldrum would decades later be fooled by it? And, it just becomes, inconceivable.
That's very interesting. And, I know also you've traveled the world. It's not just Bigfoot you've looked for and studied the
Right.
feet of. You've been to Canada. You spent time in Canada, which is their version is the Sasquatch, right?
Right.
And then
Yep.
you've been other places. Europe, the Himalayas. You've been all over, right? Looking.
Yeah, I didn't make it to the Himalayas, but the most stunning was the trip to China.
Okay.
And the most stunning because the footprints that we examined in the course of that documentary production, which afforded the opportunity to go there, were cast by a game warden, a park ranger, the Shenanjia Nature Reserve, and he was out on patrol and saw a figure, a Yeren, as they refer to them, the wild man, literally translated. And to make a long story short, he was able to get 2 casts of a right and a left footprint. And I was going to examine these, and they were going to, talk to me about it and film my reaction and my assessment of it. And they wouldn't let me see it prior to setting everything up and catching my initial reaction to my first exposure to these. But I had given Mr. Yuan, the witness, a copy of a paper I had written, where I actually describe and name the footprints, attach what's called an ichnotaxon, where you name the track or trace of the unknown animal. So you can put a handle on it. You can have a description and a differential diagnosis, and have a starting point for the conversations about it. And in that, I had this excellent illustration that I had drafted of the most distinctive example from the Patterson-Gimlin film site of this pressure ridge to illustrate this expression of the mid-tarsal break or flexion. And Mr. Yuan could not read English. I gave him a copy, but he could not read English, but it was well illustrated. And he saw this diagram of this 3 views from different angles of the 3D scan of this cast. And he got excited. He starts thumping the page, and he's pulling on my jacket sleeve, and I'm nodding in acknowledgement, and I said, okay. And shortly thereafter, we had everything set up, and he opens up this little suitcase, and out comes this toweling, wrapping up these casts, and here are these 2 casts, the right and the left feet, that are just about 15 inches in length, a little bit broader than the Patterson-Gimlin film site tracks, but with the same pressure ridge, in the same position, at the same orientation. It was just identical. And there's no way he could have had any knowledge. When his casts were gotten, I hadn't yet published my description of the significance of this feature, which wasn't widely known or recognized as a significant feature by those who had gone before. And so here's this completely independent corroboration, and that convinced me, one, that I was dead on. You can see what I'm describing occurring in the foot of the Sasquatch in the film, in the Patterson-Gimlin film. I'm absolutely confident of my interpretation because you can actually watch the dynamic take place by the track maker itself. And then having it confirmed by this example from China. And it also confirms that, yes, in fact, Sasquatch almost certainly came from Asia and still have a remnant distribution in Eastern Asia and are at the root of the traditions of the Chinese Yeren and other. There's examples of Sasquatch-like footprints through Eastern and Southern Asia, up along flanking the Himalayas, all the way west to the Caucasus Mountains, which I've also had the privilege of visiting and actually collecting replicas of footprints that were cast by a museum director there in a village where there was a sighting that involved numerous people and a long line of tracks left in snow and mud that were absolutely distinct. And if I take those casts and I shuffle them in amongst examples of Sasquatch or Bigfoot tracks from North America, you wouldn't be able to pick them out as different. They're that consistent with the size and proportions. It's just really fascinating.
Yeah, I was very curious about that,
Wow.
what the comparisons were across the board.
Yeah, well, now, and realize that I'm focusing for the point of this conversation here on the Sasquatch-like tracks. There are others. One of the things that we have learned now in anthropology, this was another problem. See, back again when people were presenting evidence of the possible existence of Sasquatch, human evolution was perceived as this rather single-file march, one species giving rise to another, being supplanted by it, and subsequently another, and so on. So you had this single-file march where there was only one bipedal hominin occupying this distinctive niche. And so where do you hang Sasquatch's hat? There's no side branch. There's no parallel. Then, over the years, it became evident that our family tree was not a single telephone pole, but rather a bushy, radiating tree with lots of parallel branches, with lots of species existing contemporaneously across the landscape, and many of those branches persisting much more recently than had ever been acknowledged previously, 20, 30 years ago even. And so Sasquatch, I think, is one of those branches, and it has representation. It was originally an Asian species that, with so many other species, came across the land bridge between continents at various times. Not always an icy tundra, but sometimes blanketed with thick, mixed deciduous coniferous forests. And these species just extended their range through available habitat. People don't often realize that over 75% of the species of mammal we consider native to North America got here from Asia at one point or another.
Yeah, wasn't there something in National Geographic not too long ago about them finding fossilization of some giant primate that walked on two legs?
Well, there might have been something about Gigantopithecus.
Yes, there you go. That's what it was, yeah.
And we don't know for certain whether it, or at all, whether it walked on two legs or four. I mean, when you're as big as a Gigantopithecus, weighing 1,200 pounds, you don't have much business climbing around in trees, because if a branch gives way, a fall from 10 feet can be fatal.
Yeah, every tree's going to fall down, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. And if you're, if Sasquatch is a modern analog of Gigantopithecus, now still extant, it inhabits temperate forests, and the resources, the sugars and starches, are not up in the forest canopy. There aren't lots of fruiting trees, maybe nuts and things, but those are best harvested once they drop to the ground anyway, because then they're ripe and there's more sugars and more easily digested carbohydrates. But in temperate forests, and particularly coniferous forests, the sugars usually are in the form of things like berries in the shrub layer, or carbs in the subterranean roots and tubers. So there's no reason to climb up into the trees. There's not a canopy that offers a lot of resources. And so once you're on the ground, you have two options. You either walk on two or you walk on fours. And if you have an ape-like anatomy that we also reflect with a broad thorax, sort of flattened from front to back, with our shoulder blades on the back rather than at the sides, just compare your chest anatomy to your pet dog or cat that has a very narrow chest compressed from side to side, shoulder blades on the sides of the bodies where they're natural extensions of the upper limb, whereas when we come down on all fours, our shoulder blades are at 90 degree angle to our shoulder, which imposes shear forces on the shoulder, which the joints don't appreciate, especially when you weigh 1,200 pounds. And plus, they have a mobile wrist from a heritage of climbing in the trees, and manipulative hand. And even at our weight, a lot of people complain of wrist pain when they try to do push-ups with their hands flat on the floor. That's why those devices with the little half rings, platforms for push-ups are popular. Or you can just turn your knuckles under and do a push-up on the backs of your knuckles instead of with your palm against the floor. Those are all heritages of an ancestor that spent a lot of time climbing and swinging in the trees, where a very mobile wrist and elbow and shoulder were advantageous. But those are not adaptations of an animal that's devoted to walking on all fours, supporting a significant portion of its weight on its forelimbs through its wrists and hands. So the point being, I think it's better than a 50-50 chance that Gigantopithecus was bipedal.
Wow.
So yes, it could be a reasonable ancestor, and we're starting to get more and more information as the fossil record of these early apes and early hominins continues to grow, that the appearance of bipedalism may have occurred multiple times independently. I mean, it's just pardon the pun, just a small step to go from the anatomy of an ape, a suspensory ape, to a bipedal hominin. And so, even today, the chimps and gorillas are quite derived. I mean, they have continued to evolve over the last 5 to 7 million years. And so you can't use those as a starting point to get from them to us. They're another branch. You have to go back into the fork in the trunk. And what was the anatomy of this thing? Well, it was much more generalized than the specialized knuckle walkers and brachiators that represent the chimps and gorillas today. So
interesting.
That's one possibility. Yeah, one possibility.
Now, you were talking earlier about you had somebody looking at fingerprints, and you actually mentioned DNA results. With the advances in eDNA, has there been anything that's possible to dig out of that? I know, we do a lot of biodiversity research through our organization, so eDNA, just using soil, you can find find pretty much anything that's ever been around the area if it's peed, pooped, bled, any of that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Have you had any luck with any of that stuff?
Not yet. Although, well, it's hard. Here's the quandary. One, we're dealing with an animal that, if it does indeed exist, is in my estimation extremely rare.
Right.
And this seems to be reflected in the fact that we have a very limited footprint record, and what we have has numerous examples of repeat appearances of particular individuals that are recognizable by their size and proportion and toe configuration. You can recognize someone's by their footprint, and that was one of the first questions that occurred to me as I was getting involved with this: is if these creatures are as rare as I think they are, then if we find footprints in a given geographical region, the chances of the repeat appearance of a particular one of those few individuals should be pretty high. So I started looking for those kinds of repeat appearances and kept finding example after example.
Interesting.
So keep in mind the potential rarity. The rule of thumb that I use, and I won't go into how we derive it, but the rule of thumb is for every 200 black bear, there's maybe one Sasquatch. They're that different in their natural history parameters that a large-bodied ape reproduces very slowly, has a longer life expectancy, invests a lot in the slow development of its offspring, etc. It doesn't take a lot to sustain the numbers over time.
And if there was, there had to be enough genetic diversity behind something to make it survive too, to be able to kind of get the lineage going out, right?
True, there is, and so you have to have a viable, population. But sometimes, and especially in conservation, sometimes that notion of the necessity for X number of individuals in a species in order to maintain viability gets oversimplified in the name of conservation, conservatism.
Okay.
Put it that way. So combine that. If you it is entirely dependent on the genetic load, how much deleterious or harmful recessive genes are found in the genome of a particular species, and therefore what would be the inbreeding depression pressure that population would experience if their numbers are reduced. And there are some populations, like gorillas, for example, who have been studied extensively with this question in mind, and they've discovered that they have a very limited genetic load, and in fact tolerate inbreeding quite readily without a lot of harmful recessive traits popping up. And
is that a common thing in primates?
Well, I don't know how common it is. I haven't looked broadly, but in mountain gorillas, the effort has been made because of their apparently precipitous status. I mean, you had a bottleneck of probably down to 200 or 300 at one point, and so, but now they've bounced back, but they're still under 1,000. But they've done repeated tests and have shown that they're not suffering from those low numbers. Now, obviously, I mean, if you have an imperiled species, an endangered species, the more genetic diversity you have, the better. The better it can cope with changing pressures or pressure of development and human expansion and so forth. And so that's ideal. But in the absence of that luxury, species could still exist. So, excuse me, when people turn to me and say, well, there couldn't possibly be enough Sasquatch out there to sustain a population. Otherwise, we'd be seeing them all the time. Well, one, they're seen a lot more frequently than people are willing to admit. But two, hey, they can get by with low reproductive rates and low numbers if they have a fairly clean, well-filtered gene pool that isn't burdened with a lot of recessive deleterious traits. So it's so funny. One time I was doing a phone interview like this, and on a radio station, and they had a caller. I think it was a setup, and he just went at me. He was really attacking me, especially about eyewitness testimony, and he was citing repeatedly Elizabeth Loftus's work. She gained some notoriety for her work in litigations as an expert testimony witness, with testimony calling into question the reliability of recall of eyewitness testimony. And he said, are you familiar with her work? And I said, well, yes, I know of her work. He said, well, then how can you put any credence on these eyewitness testimonies? I said, it's very different when you're talking about regressed memories that you're calling out, calling out either ethically or unethically, or the case of not to be sexist at all, but a little old lady whose purse was snatched, and she's standing there looking at a lineup of potential perps here, and trying to pick out, and you're arguing her testimony is not reliable, her recall is not reliable. I said, but imagine on the other case, you've got an eyewitness who claims to have seen a Bigfoot, and you've got a different lineup. In this case, it's a moose, a bear, a deer, a wolf, a Bigfoot, and a backpacker. I said, it's apples and oranges. And he just wasn't having it, and we went on, and I was...
That's a great way of breaking it down.
Yeah. But then he goes, and here's where the clincher was. He said, he just got frustrated with my unwillingness to acknowledge his point, and he said, how can there be the proverbial 800-pound gorilla out there walking around the woods, and nobody is seeing it? And I go, what are you talking about? People are seeing it all the time.
That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, but you're dismissing all of their eyewitness testimony out of hand. You can't have it both ways, And so anyway, back to your question. See, I'm terrible at this digression. I get off on a tangent.
It's my favorite word, by the way. I digress is my favorite thing on the entire planet. So don't worry about that at all.
Yeah, they're all fruitful byways, but eDNA. So, as you point out, eDNA has this capacity, this potential for identifying all these critters that are, all these woodland creatures that are leaving their bodily fluids here, there, and everywhere. But are you sampling where a Bigfoot just happened to be recently enough that the sample has persisted in the environment? Now, we did do our due diligence when some investigators discovered what could have been possibly Bigfoot nests. These were, for all intents and purposes, just like gorilla nests in Africa, made on the ground, except even more elaborate, in fact, because there was this undercarriage of branches piled up and making a kind of a springy foundation onto which forest litter and debris was then piled up, and then the crowning element was they broke off these spriggers, these sprouts of these about 7 foot tall evergreen blueberry branches, and had woven in on top of all of this a nest, like a bird's nest, with a raised lip and a depressed central area. Well, when they tried to, they set up camera traps and everything and tried to not disturb the area anymore, but observe it. Eventually, when nothing happened, they had moved on. It wasn't an ongoing occupation site. They allowed me to come in, and we cut a wedge, just like a pie, out of one of the nests using shears and saws and so forth, and just carefully lifted that out, and we did kind of a stratigraphic analysis of the nest, and then took all of that pie slice, put it in a great big construction garbage bag, brought it home and spread it out and let it dry, and then I had students helping me pick through the entire thing and collected every single fiber, whether it was hair or plant or whatever might be misidentified. We had samples that appeared to be primate in nature. And in addition, I took core samples from the nests and from the central areas of all the debris and so forth, and we shipped those off to a laboratory at it was Todd Dissetill's lab at that time at City University of New York, and he tested it with using eDNA probes, and had the whole litany of forest creatures, as you might expect, but the only primate he concluded was human. Well, here's the rub, though, and the problem that I continue, and I had this conversation with him. I said, because all he tested was the probe was for cytochrome oxidase 2 in the mitochondria, and it came back. He had tested just a small portion of that with probes, and he was satisfied because he said the sequence that he looked at he could use that to differentiate between Neanderthal and human. There were a couple of substitutions that were characteristic of in that comparison, and I said, well, yeah, but that's Neanderthal.
Right.
They have their own evolutionary history, and that isn't necessarily. I mean, if we're talking about something that is an early hominin rather than an ape, that is perhaps, if it were a Gigantopithecus, it could be more distantly related to us than, say, a modern chimpanzee. But if it's something like a Paranthropus, which we didn't talk about, but a robust relative of Lucy that had these very deep, deep jaws and heavy teeth and had features that, if combined with gigantic proportions, and it could have radiated out of Africa, across Asia, into the temperate latitudes where it attained gigantism during the Pleistocene, as did so many other mammal species in the northern latitudes. At that time, the Pleistocene megafauna. But the point being is, if it is a hominin, it's even more closely related to us than chimpanzees. Well, chimpanzees share, 94, 96% identity in their DNA sequence. They differ from us only in a few percentage points. This creature could be even more closely related. It may differ by only 0.5%. And so, unless you have hit on one of those differences, that constitute just 0.5%, what's your result going to be? Well, it's going to come back as human. And that's what we've run into time and time again. Yes, a sample will be sent. First of all, the hair samples, lacking a cellular medulla, it's very challenging to get DNA from the hair, from a shed hair that doesn't have a skin tag or an active follicle attached to it.
Wow.
And when they have gotten DNA, it invariably has come back as human. And the conclusion is that it is contaminated through mishandling, or that it's simply a human hair that's misidentified as being of interest, in association with some event or some search. But the third possibility is you just haven't sequenced enough to tell the difference between the two.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So the only thing. So anyway, that's kind of the quandary we're up against. There is a project now commencing with a gentleman who has, I say, enough time has lapsed that there's a new generation of scholars, both in anthropology, but more importantly for this, in molecular genetics and so on, that they're a little more open-minded. They haven't been indoctrinated. And so he was able to recruit a couple of molecular geneticists to assist him in a project to evaluate some of these otherwise unattributable hair samples and see if they can actually get some DNA. So I'm crossing my fingers. That's been I've kind of stalled out on this. We were trying to put together an eDNA project after, I don't know if you were aware of the publicity surrounding the group that looked at the islands or the waters of Loch Ness and did a very
indeed
comprehensive.
Adrian talked to us about that whenever we had him on a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, we had Adrian Shine on a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling us about the eDNA studies they had done there, looking for reptile, dino, sturgeon, European
eel.
Catfish, and eel.
Yeah. Well, I, inspired by that a little bit, by someone who was willing to tackle a project like that, I got in. I can't take credit. In this case, it was at the urging. I had a cold call. Someone reached out to me. It turns out they were a Kiwi from New Zealand who had studied under Neil Gemmell in New Zealand, who was one of the principal investigators on that project. And this student was now a postdoc, former student, was now a postdoc at UC Davis, had gone up to Yellowstone to see the sites, was aware of my work, and had followed a lot of my publications and so forth. So he, Yellowstone's just 2.5 hours north of us, and he said, "Can I stop in for a visit and a chat?" I said, "Absolutely." I thought it was a great opportunity to pick the brain of a budding molecular biologist as well. And I posed, we had this similar conversation. He says, "You've got to talk to my mentor." I go, "Oh, who's that?" And he says, "Neil Gemmell." And I didn't recognize it at first, but then he explained. And I said, "You really think he'd be interested?" And he said, "I think he would." So back before the pandemic outbreak, we were putting things together to launch a eDNA survey of primarily the Pacific Northwest, focusing first on these nest sites and related ones, and then branching out. But
high sighting areas and stuff would be probably the most appropriate.
Yeah.
Yep. Interesting.
And then the pandemic hit and took the wind out of the sails, and then I've had obviously some setbacks and things that have thwarted us getting a head of steam built up again, and I've not lost contact. I've been out of contact with him for quite some time. So that's potentially in the offing. I want to see how this project progresses, where they're looking at the hair samples, just doing conventional sequencing analysis first, because obviously, when I asked, there was a little bit of sticker shock when I asked Neil what he thought it would take, because his wish list included a postdoc and a couple of graduate students and multi-year project to do it properly. And so I thought, well, let's wait and see how this other one goes, and then before I throw in the towel completely will maybe.
Yeah, it's a pretty serious undertaking.
Yeah.
It's a pretty serious undertaking.
So
So I got a couple more questions for you.
Yep, please do, please.
What has the effect been of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti being like a mainstream topic in movies and TV shows, podcasts, social media?
Yeah.
How has that changed in the positive or the negative, the work you're doing?
Yeah. Well, as with so many things, it's probably best described as a double-edged sword. So it has raised the awareness, the public awareness of the subject, and I hope. I have, in my opinion, the caliber of some of the treatment, especially in the cable television world, but also with video shorts and things, YouTube videos and whatnot. The quality has increased, but it's unfortunately plateaued. We've sort of hit a point where there's not a lot of innovative analysis or thought. There have been a few things. We did something really interesting with the Patterson-Gimlin film. It's still ticking. It's still giving up interesting perspectives and so forth. There's the DNA study on the horizon. There still are things that messages I'm trying to get out, and much more systematic analyses that could be done on the footprint evidence still, because I haven't been able to drive the message home entirely, and there are still people who think that I've got this silly theory, this silly model, and don't recognize the remarkable corroborative reinforcing examples that bolster it. So I think that on the positive side, it has continued to raise the level of awareness and the level of interest. There's a whole new generation of folks. I get a sort of a default barometer in the number of sales of my book at the conventions and so forth, and in general, because you have a lot of sales to begin with, and you kind of hit a plateau. In my case, thankfully, it broke far beyond the limits of the number of people in the quote Bigfoot community. So, which is about some of my friends, colleagues, say if you write a book about Bigfoot, you can expect to sell about 4,000 copies, because that's it. You saturate the Bigfoot community with it. And my book is well up in the 14,000 mark. So that's nothing to write home about. But what it tells me is that it's reaching beyond the Bigfoot enthusiast community. Other people are reading it, and I hope some of those are some of my colleagues, or more importantly, some students of the upcoming generation who express interest in the subject. And I think the book has so I see an uptick. I've seen now an uptick again, resurgence in sales, which belies that subsequent generation now doing it. The negative is when it's treated in a jocular fashion, wink, wink, nod, nod. It rarely, when it's covered on the news, rarely does it rise to a scientific feature. It's always the little human interest story at the end of the broadcast, where they can chuckle and get away with it, and very, there's just very few times that it's given a real serious platform. When NPR, had an interview with Jane Goodall, and she acknowledged to a caller who got past the screeners and asked a Bigfoot question of her. The guy, Ira Flato, was flabbergasted that she said that she really did think that there was a good possibility that Sasquatch existed, that she had talked to so many, unfortunately she diffused it a little bit by saying she was a romantic and she really hoped that they existed. I mean, that's not what a serious scientist should say
Right.
on national radio. If you're trying to further the topic, seriously.
Yeah.
But her endorsement on my book, not of the existence of Sasquatch, but that this is a question worthy of scientific consideration. And, the foreword to my book was written by George Schaller, who doesn't have as wide a name recognition as Jane Goodall, but has the credentials and then some as, the naturalist's naturalist. Again, not endorsing the existence of Sasquatch, but endorsing the pursuit and the presentation of the evidence in an objective fashion. Talk about when I had a journalist one time sitting across from me and said that they had taken the liberty of talking with some students and faculty, and they said, "You're considered a joke on this campus." And I said, "Well, yeah, I can imagine who you talk to." And I said, "What about this?" And I hold up my book and show those names, and then in the paperback, if you open up, there's 2 pages of endorsements by professionals of all stripes, whether academicians or professional, state veterinarians or wildlife biologists or park rangers and so forth. And I said, these people have the acumen and credentials. You talk to who? Why should I be worried about what they think? What a student on campus thinks, or an instructor in the physics department who was one of my most vocal critics on campus. He's now retired, but why should I care what they think? I mean, let them engage the evidence, and rather than attacking me personally, with ad hominem attacks. They're not qualified or informed to engage in a intelligent conversation about the evidence. Just as I wouldn't, presume to. Well, I did one time, because this guy, he was a frequent contributor to our editorial column in our little local newspaper. He was friends with the editor, and so he had kind of a freewheeling arrangement. He did also have a regular column, and I was often the brunt of anytime he needed a straw man for something that he thought was silly or had no justification. He would cite me as an example of that.
That's
but anyway,
awful.
At one point he was
bad.
going after me. Yeah, he was going. Well, here, just to show how bad it got. One year, it must have been a slow spring, because he wrote a column called Bigfoot and the Easter Bunny. And he went on and on, just attacking me. And ultimately, basically, the bottom line was, I would be as justified in my academic career searching for the Easter Bunny as I am justified looking for Bigfoot. And then down in the physics department, somebody brought in one of those lawn statues, those lawn ornaments of Bigfoot you see in the used to be in the Sky Mall magazine, all the time.
Yep.
And hung a little Easter basket full of plastic Easter eggs on it. And it was in the department office down in the physics department for months or years. I don't know if it's still there anymore. I doubt it. There's been a changing of the guard. But at one point,
That's terrible.
At one point he was echoing Michael Shermer's. Michael Shermer? Yeah, Michael Shermer, the ideological skeptic, has made a name for himself, writing books and editing magazines. But Michael Shermer, one of his mantras, which he first unveiled in Scientific American in a column about Bigfoot, it was, the science starts once you have a body. Come to me once you have a body. And my retort has always been, that's the most inane statement. The science starts when you ask a question, and how you go about addressing that question and hypothesizing and gathering data. It's not once you have the body, the conclusive evidence anyway.
And the audacity, because so much of physics is theoretical. And
there's my point.
It's allowing the evidence to convince us. It's like, come on.
Exactly. So I wrote back in his column, or in response to his column, that's exactly what I did. As I said, this is really funny coming, because his department chairman also wrote a letter of kind of in support and reiterating his point. And I wrote back and I said, how ridiculous, this coming from two physicists. I said, most of what you do doesn't have a body. Show me an atom, show me a black hole, show me a string. You guys spend all this time on theoretical phenomenon, and how do you study it? You look at the traces it leaves behind. You look at the interactions with its surrounding environment. I said, isn't that interesting? That's kind of the same thing I'm doing, looking at footprints, looking at eyewitness encounters, listening to vocalizations. I said the science starts when you pose a question. So anyway, I'm rambling on.
No, that was pretty neat. That was pretty neat. All right, so one of our EEARSS members had a question for you. This was from Wayne Lindsay. It says, a number of years ago on the show Monster Quest, you flew into a remote fishing cabin on a lake in eastern Canada and stayed at the cabin for several days with a group of other researchers. And one night there were some, he puts in air quotes, incidents around the cabin. Do you know if there were any more reports later from the cabin area? First off, can you tell us what in the world he's talking about? And
yes.
Yeah, there we go.
So Monster Quest was a great series. Doug Hychek has had personal experiences. At first, I even discuss it in the book, because he was the producer of Monster Quest, was also the producer of the documentary Sasquatch Legend Meets Science that was the inspiration for the book, and therefore used the same title. It was intended initially as a companion volume, but grew, outstripped that restriction and includes a lot more. But Doug Hychek treats the subject very, very fairly and objectively. And so on this episode, we went up to a fishing cabin that he had been to and had a really interesting experience, where the cabin was pounded upon and literally rocked on its moorings by something that was screaming like a woman being murdered, and scared the daylights out of them. He was up there with a couple of colleagues, and in fact the cabin owner, the airline owner, had a couple of float planes. They fly clients up to these remote fishing lakes, and that's the only access. They were up there on a daddy-daughter outing, and so the girls were terrified of the screams and the cabin literally rocking on its foundation. Yeah. So we went up to film an episode of Monster Quest, and we went paddled all across the lake. We were using thermal imaging and at a time when they weren't readily available, and so it was kind of a cumbersome device and very, very difficult to utilize. But very impressive, the results. To be able to look out and see a person otherwise invisible standing in the foliage under the canopy, and be able to see him just clear as can be with this device was really something. But in any case, long story short, we would make a habit of staying up late and around the fire pit, and sometimes we would try our hand at projecting our voices, trying to imitate our impression of a Sasquatch vocalization. We were doing the old standard wood knocks and waiting for responses and whatnot. And, well, at one point, I'm unfortunately not a good night person, and I was starting to flag a bit, and I said, I've got to go in and splash some water on my face, or I'm going to fall asleep, fall into the fire. So I went in, and Doug's son, Dwayne, went over to the porch. The outhouse was back about 30 yards behind the cabin, down this little catwalk, but in the pitch blackness of night, on a moonless night, he, a young guy and not a bit of a city slicker, he was not used to being out in the woods, and so going back there was not in the offing for him. So he was relieving himself from the front porch into the bushes. And this cabin is sided all the way around with corrugated steel siding. And so all of a sudden, I'm inside, splashing some water in my face and getting a drink, and I hear this whack, like someone had shot a marble out of a wrist rocket and hit the side of the house with quite a ping, loud, resounding ping, and right next to where Dwayne was standing. And I could see him shuffling across the porch, trying to hike his pants back up, which was already pretty low, and his eyes were as big as saucers. And so I walked out there, and they go, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" I said, "Yeah, I heard that." I said, "Which one of you threw the rock at Dwayne?" And I looked at the expressions on each of their faces, and I was just testing to see how they would react. And they were innocent, obviously. And so one of the group says, "Well, I'm going to throw a rock out there into the woods." And I jokingly said, "Well, don't throw anything too big. It may turn around and throw it right back to you." And so he looks at me, and he kind of, with that realization, and he picks up a golf ball sized rock, and he lobs it back in. You could hear it bounce off a couple tree trunks. And a few minutes went by, and then sure enough, in the firelight, you could see. I was facing the right direction, so I caught it in my peripheral vision. I could see a rock arcing towards the roof of the cabin, and it bounced down across the cabin with a resounding bongity bong bong down across this tin roof. And these guys just went bonkers, and it was like a little row of peahens. They all went scooting into the cabin, leaving me standing all by myself by the fire pit. And I'm going, "Guys."
I would have died. I would have died right there.
Well, I said, "Well, this is what we're here for. Where are you going?" Well, of course they, and then because the fire pit was a culvert that was sort of raised, extending up above the ground, so it cast a long shadow. I didn't see this cordwood there right by the fire pit. I stepped on a little piece of cordwood and rolled my ankle, and went right down to the ground. And they, from the cabin, all they saw was me go fall into the ground. So they thought I'd been beamed by a rock. To their credit, they came racing out to make sure I was okay.
That's
and I
real
go, "What
friends.
are you guys doing?"
Yeah, that's real friends.
"What are you guys doing in the cabin?" And they go, "Oh, we were getting the camera equipment." But unfortunately, on camera, Kurt, the guy who threw the rock, he said, on camera, "Here we are, cowering in the cabin." Well, I got so much email asking, "Why were you guys cowering in the cabin?" Well, I wasn't. I was never in the cabin. But they wanted to know why we weren't out there looking for it. Well, we did, and to no avail. I mean, this thing, it was pitch black. It's really hard to make your way around there because you're on the Canadian Shield, this big chunk of granite, and there are crevices all over, overgrown with moss and brush. You go walking out there in the dark, you can step in one of these crevices and break a leg. I'm not exaggerating. So we weren't really ready to go plunging into the depths of the forest in the pitch black. So nothing happened, and several hours went by. It was about 2:30, almost 3 in the morning now, and I'm saying, "Look, I can't do this anymore. I'm not a coffee drinker, and so if I don't have a Mountain Dew or something, or some straight caffeine to pop to keep a no dose, I'm just not up for it." And so they all agreed that, okay, we'll go to bed, but we're going to keep our boots on, basically, sleep with our boots on in case something happens. No sooner did the lights go out, and my eyelids are just getting heavy, then go wham, bang, bang, bang. And this got edited from the episode for some reason, just for the sake of time, I guess. Someone had lobbed a chunk of cordwood from the cutting pile in the back onto the roof of the cabin. Well, now, if it's raining cordwood, that's different than golf balls. I wasn't ready to go outside in the backyard, and so we're peering out, looking with the thermal and the night vision into the back, and in hopes that something breaks cover. And eventually, we did go out and examine where the cordwood had bounced across the roof and rolled off onto the stoop on the back of the house. but nothing happened, and that was kind of the end of it. And so, the other interesting part about that whole episode is the cabin had been ransacked by something. The only other thing it could have been was bear. But they had, in order to prevent this from recurring, the old guard trick or method was to put a nail board in front of the doors so that something wouldn't step there, couldn't get a footing to push against the door. And so in this case, it wasn't just nails, it was galvanized screws, 3-inch screws up through this half-inch piece of plywood, bigger than a welcome mat, so it can the full width of the door and about 1.5 feet deep. Well, I had been informed that something had stepped on it and that there was blood still on it. And so I was all excited, we could get DNA from this, but I said, so where have you been storing it? Oh, it's just been leaning up against the cabin for 2 years.
No.
Well, there's not any hope of getting DNA from that. It's been out in the sun and the change in temperature and snow drifts and so forth. And I said, well, let's at least look at it. And so we can at least talk about it on camera. So as we're getting ready and they're talking about it, you can see caught in the threads of these screws, there are hairs, clearly long hairs. And they're the right consistency. The what we think is Sasquatch hair is about the same consistency as human head hair. It's about 65 microns across. It's not nearly as coarse as bear hair, for example, bear guard hairs. And I'm looking closer, and there's some of the screws that have a fatty residue. And then there's also some that have what looks like beef jerky caught in the threads down at the very base against the board, especially. And then there's blood. It looks like red paint almost. It's so degraded, but there's red, and it actually had run down under or through the screw along the screw shaft, and there was pools of blood adhering to the undersurface of the board. And I'm going, well, this is interesting. And I started looking, and there were some screws that were clean and some that had residue. So we played this little game of dot to dot, and I outlined all the screws that had residue. And what you had was the outline of the back 2/3 of a big foot with a rounded heel that would have been probably, if you allowed for the extension to accommodate the toes and the initial forefoot, it was about an 18-inch foot.
What?
And the oily residue was the sole pad, and the beef jerky was the I got it reversed. The fatty pad was down lower. The fat was lower, and the beef jerky was the highest. So the beef jerky was muscle tissue, where the threads had gone through a substantial sole pad, and had intersected the intrinsic muscles of the foot. And I'm thinking, my gosh, So we carefully collected some of the tissue, and we carefully unwound, untangled some of the hair. The hair under examination did indeed look like some of our, what we call the gold standard of Sasquatch hair. The lack of a cellular medulla, parallel sided shaft of about 65 microns, a blunt worn tip, no signs of cutting, and so forth. So it was really quite an interesting trip, I tell you. But they tried to get DNA. Apparently there was something in the galvanizing material that inhibited the primers. And so the first lab sort of threw up their hands, said we weren't able to successfully get DNA from this blood. They were trying the blood scrapings. But Kurt was not satisfied, so he ran it out on a gel, multiple times trying to wash it of the contaminant. And, you'd run it into the gel and then cut out the stained sample and then re-elute it and run it out in another gel and do that 2 or 3 times. He sequenced several hundred bases. I don't know why it was so limited, but it was essentially identical to humans, with the exception of one apparent substitution, which was occasionally reported in chimpanzees, but never in a human sample that was in the base. Well, the problem was about 300 bases. That's not very much.
Yeah.
And as much as it was manipulated, you could introduce some damage. I mean, it would be pretty coincidental if it were exactly a substitution you found in a chimp and not in a human. How do you interpret that then anyway? So that kind of never went beyond that, and I fell out of touch with. I didn't hold high hopes for the prospect of getting reliable DNA sequence from any of that sample because of its condition.
I mean, its age, yeah.
Didn't think it worthy of pursuit beyond that.
Interesting stuff. Well, Dr. Meldrum, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to chat with us. This has been a very intriguing conversation. It's always nice whenever you have something that maybe you don't have a whole lot of understanding of from our side, to hear somebody who waxes very scientific describe it and really break it down for us. And this has been an absolute honor, sir. I really, really appreciate the time, and hope we can chat with you again sometime.
Well, I'd love to, and I'll try to curtail my verbosity, and I'd like to hear more of your perspectives and so forth. I'm terrible when it comes to that. It's like,
Buddy, you're passionate about the subject.
That's why you're here. We want to hear you.
Yeah, that's the reason we have you on.
We don't know
here.
anything about this.
Yeah, this has been an absolute honor, sir, and really, really appreciate your time, because I know your times as a professor is very valuable. We really super appreciate it.
You bet. My pleasure. It's enjoyable.
All right, sir. We'll be talking to you again soon. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, that was very interesting.
I want to call him back and talk to him for the rest of the night.
No, that's a guy that you could easily talk to that guy for another 2 hours.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know, man. I feel like we barely touched the surface of a very deep conversation.
Oh, yeah.
So
when can we get him on for a part 2?
Yeah, we'll need to do that again for sure.
I want all the stories. I want.
It's something else.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's something else. Wow. Yeah, we're very blessed to be able to have these kind of conversations with people and let them talk about the stuff they're working on, and just sit back and enjoy it and pop questions off. It's a lot of fun. I appreciate you guys a lot. This is always a blast. Yeah, this is.
The day you told us we were going to interview him, I truly honestly was not familiar with who he was. I don't know. I previously did not know much. That night I was watching BuzzFeed Unsolved, and I hear them say his name, and I'm like, what? So I, of course, watched the episode, and I'm like, how does Frank meet these people? How is this somebody I'm getting to interview? What is happening?
Well, it's funny, I'd heard his name mentioned by Wayne many times, and I'm like, if we're going to interview Adrian Shine, we can't not go into that and then not go into this. There's just, and it's some really unique science. I mean, some people call it cryptozoology, but I think that's, I don't know how I feel about it. Honest to goodness, I don't know how I feel about it, but it's a really intriguing thing that when you hear somebody like him discuss it very matter-of-factly, it's kind of hard to, I'm not going to tell the guy he's full of it. I think he's obviously got something there.
Well, and I thought that he acknowledged the uncertainty of it.
Yeah, no doubt. Which is just like Adrian did, which was
right.
You love to hear that. You love to hear somebody in the science world go, we're walking down the path to see what we can figure out.
Right.
It seems very likely there's something there, and we're gonna figure out what it is.
Yep.
Which is the coolest part of science.
Exactly.
Yeah, let's jam up. Yeah, and it was I don't know. We could go on about this for the next hour just talking about the conversation. So we should probably end the conversation.
Yes.
This has been a record-long podcast, and it was
indeed.
It was deserved. It was deserved. Okay. All right, y'all. Thank you for tuning into the EEARSS Podcast. You can find us on all platforms by searching EEARSS, or EEARSS, the longest acronym on the planet. Thank you all for tuning in. You can find us on all platforms, again, by searching EEARSS, because I said that twice. We'll catch you all next week. Bye-bye.